I'm going to jump in by talking about a couple of different quotes. And one of these names may be very familiar to you guys if you have trauma-informed care training, or if you just have sort of an interest in trauma. And if you want to learn more about trauma, this first author is someone whose most recent book I actually used as a textbook in my class at the MSW program. That's how important I think he is in terms of trauma research. And he's also very understandable, and I think makes a lot of the material very accessible. So I'll talk a little bit more about him in a moment. So his name is Bessel van der Kolk. He's probably the most well-known name in the world in terms of writing and speaking about trauma. He travels all over the world. And at a training that he did, this is something that he said that really struck me and stayed with me for a long, long time. And so I use this to sort of introduce how we're going to be talking about trauma today and tomorrow, and why I think it's so important that you guys are doing this as an agency and doing this training. So this is what he has to say about trauma. In fact, the past is the past, and the only thing that matters is what happens right now. And what is trauma is the residue that a past event leaves in your own sensory experiences in your body. Don't forget to mute yourself. And I'll ask you guys to unmute when we do some discussion. Trauma is the residue that a past event leaves in your own sensory experiences in your body. And it's not that event out there that becomes intolerable, but the physical sensations with which you live that become intolerable. And you will do anything to make them go away. Now, there's a lot going on here in a really short paragraph, so I'm going to break it down and talk about a couple of different ideas here. The first one I think is so important because it's kind of counterintuitive, right? If you've worked with trauma, if you know people in your own life with trauma or your clients with trauma, you know that there's sort of this thing that people say, right? Which is, well, how about if you just don't think about it? Just don't think about it. Right? Or my personal favorite, you need closure, or you need to let it go. And don't worry, you guys, I will not be singing Let It Go. It's a little early in the morning for everybody for that. But there's this idea, right, that it's just this bad thing in the past. And if you would just stop thinking about it, then, you know, it'll be fine. And I think especially if we're talking about, again, any kind of vulnerable population, there's this idea that I see this a lot in terms of like, if I see behavior plans, or if I do staffings, you know, for somebody, a clinical staffing in an agency or whatever, a lot of times there's this directive that staff are given to redirect, which really just means distract, right? Just change the subject, talk about something else. And I can't tell you that there are never times that that's an appropriate strategy, but generally speaking, I think it really misses the whole point of what trauma is all about. Trauma is not about the past. If you've ever worked with folks with trauma, as I've said, or if you know people grappling with trauma, this idea of like, oh, just stop thinking about it. Like, oh, great, that's a good idea. I wish I'd thought of it. Believe me, anybody struggling with trauma has tried not thinking about it. But trauma is about today. Trauma is about the here and now. The event that maybe caused the physical reactions that someone is living with may have happened years or even decades ago, but the reactions to it, the residue, as van der Kolk says, is here and now. Just like kids can get lead poisoning from paint that was put on the wall 100 years ago, right? The original thing maybe happened a long time ago. The damage is still here. So simply understanding that you can't say to somebody, just don't think about it or let it go, is a really important role for you guys to be able to play, because I think it's really painful and sometimes just a deep invalidation when someone says to someone grappling with trauma, well, just don't think about it, right? Even though it's very understandable, I get how people get there. I'm going to tell you a story that really helped me understand what it means when we say that trauma is here and now, even though the event may be in the past. So when I was in school, I had a professor who had gone to Vietnam when he was a young man, and he was trained to be a medic. So what that meant in that war was that he would be at a medical base. They would get a call over the radio. They would fly to where some fighting had been going on, hopefully not shot down. right? Because they could all die. Landing somewhere. Hopefully the fighting was calm enough that they could run out and grab people. Sometimes they were dodging gunfire. They would run out to where the soldiers were and try to grab them to get them onto the helicopter. I will not describe to you what he said sometimes happened when they went to pull the soldiers away. Get them onto the helicopter, take off, and then fight desperately to keep the soldiers alive on that flight to get them back to the medical base. Needless to say, many soldiers did not survive the flight. And I also will not describe to you what he said the inside of that helicopter was like, what the cabin was like on that flight back, what he saw, what he heard, what he was exposed to. So this was his job as a young man, maybe the age of some of the mothers you might be working with. I think he was like 20, 21, something like that. And then he came back home and he finished his education and eventually became a clinical social worker and a professor with a PhD. And one day he and his wife decided to go to the movies here in Columbus. And the movie that was showing was called The Deer Hunter. Now, this is an older movie now, so you guys may not be familiar with it, but it was one of the first very graphic, very realistic movies about the Vietnam War. And what he told generations of students afterwards was he couldn't tell you what was on the screen because his brain had not recorded that information. He didn't have access to that. What he did know was that 1 minute he was a professor and a therapist sitting next to his wife. The next thing he knew, he was crouched in the middle of the movie theater, screaming, incoming, while his wife and an usher were dragging him out of the theater, physically dragging. So I can tell you a couple of things. One thing is that he was not thinking about the war. He wasn't remembering it. For those few seconds, when his body was reacting by screaming and leaping out of his chair and crouching down, he was living the war. He was in the war. So any sense of like past or present was gone. This was his full physical and sensory experience. It wasn't a memory and it wasn't a thought. The next thing is really a question for you guys, and I won't ask you to respond, but I want you to just think about it. I want you to imagine some of the settings that some of your clients might be in. Let's say a teenager in a group home or a mother in a homeless shelter or something like that. And imagine that going to the movies, maybe there's some outing or something. One of your moms had jumped into the aisle screaming and had to be physically dragged out of the theater. And I want you to ask yourself what that person would be told when they got back home. We know, right? We know what they would be told. They would be told, that's the end of movies for you. No more, you're not going on any outings for a while. Why? Because of your, if we were all in a room together, we could all say it together, because of your poor choices or because of your behavior, right? And I know you guys don't serve the DD population specifically, but I think a lot of the folks that you work with may be sort of in that borderline intellectual functioning range, right? I promise you, if they were a kid at a school or in a group home or wherever, they would immediately lose privileges. And that would happen because they would be told of how they had behaved. Well, my mental health folks know this, right? When I first started working in the DD world, this was, it was really fun to be in this new field. And I loved all the people I got to work with when I started kind of working a little bit in the sort of that overlap between mental health and developmental disabilities. But one of the things that was very strange for me was when people would talk about folks having behaviors. I don't know if that's as common in housing or what you guys are going to be doing, but I would be told, oh, Laura's just having a behavior. What does that mean? Is that like having a donut? I don't get it. What is that? But in mental health, you know, we think of behavior and feelings and thoughts and body experiences and sensations all kind of wrapped together in the same thing. If I lift up my cup to drink coffee, you guys assume that it's because I decided to do that. If I were talking to you today and I suddenly had a grand mal seizure and I fell to the floor and started convulsing, none of you would say, what an odd choice she's making. I wonder why she decided to behave that way. You would understand that what was happening in that moment was out of my conscious control. Well, as we talk more about trauma over the next 2 days, what we're really going to spend some time with is in those few seconds when my professor was having that flashback, what he was experiencing neurologically, physically, was much closer to a seizure than it was a behavior, because he wasn't choosing that. And you guys didn't know him, and he passed away some years ago. I am assuming you guys didn't know him. So you'll have to take my word for it when I tell you that he did not decide to do that. He did not decide to leap out of his chair and disrupt a movie theater full of strangers and humiliate himself and terrify his wife. That was not a decision he made. But many of the folks that you guys are going to be working with may have been told at some point that they were choosing these reactions or these flashbacks that they may have experienced because of trauma. So simply being able to understand it and reflect that back to someone, that you know that in those few seconds, they're not deciding what they're doing, whether that's lashing out or shutting down or any of those trauma reactions that we'll be talking about a little bit later. That's not a choice that they're making, right? So I think right from the get-go, that's a big shift. And your ability to understand that and reflect that back to someone, or as I said, to advocate that with someone else, I think that makes what you're doing really pivotal in the lives of some of the folks that you're going to be working with. A couple more things just in this paragraph. I told you there was a lot in here, right? So the next thing he says, it's not that event that out there that becomes intolerable, but the physical sensations with which you live that become intolerable. So I want you to imagine for a second, and I'm guessing most of us have not had the experiences that my professor did in Vietnam. I hope you haven't. But I want you to imagine, and I won't ask you to share this. I want you to think about a time that you were the most frightened, or the most horrified, or the most terrified. Even just sort of touching in on that for a second, I think we sort of can call up those physical sensations, what that feels like in our body. Now imagine that that could replay itself. You could relive it at any given moment with no warning. What would you be willing to do to make that not happen? Or once it did start happening, that level, the level of terror and horror that would make you jump out of your seat and start screaming, what would you be willing to do to make it stop? Well, I can tell you what I would be willing to do. I'd be willing to drink too much. I'd be willing to use drugs. I would overeat, starve myself, cut myself. I would have sex with inappropriate people. I would spend or gamble. I would do whatever I could think of, lacking any other resources to deal with it. I would do anything I could think of to make it stop. And so would you. And I think of all the things this paragraph does, that might be the most important. The most important word might be the word you. So van der Kolk, when he said this to the audience, he was looking right at us, and he didn't say, you know, if you're a messed up veteran, or if you have mental problems, or, you know, if you're a runaway teen or whatever, or a single mom. He didn't, he looked at all of us in the room and he said, you in the right set of circumstances would be willing to do anything. Punch someone in the face the first time you saw him? Yeah, no problem. Absolutely. Right? You tell me. I would be willing to do it, given the right set of circumstances, to make that intolerable level of fear and terror stop happening. Right? So as we're talking, I'm hoping that some of the folks that you've worked with in the past, or the people that, I don't know if you guys have actually started taking in clients yet or not, but you can imagine the women you're going to be working with, some things should be coming into focus, right? Where, oh, that's why this person punched their coworker instead of talking it out. Oh, now I see why this person may continue with the behavior that other people see correctly as destructive or irresponsible. Why would you be doing this thing? And I can't say that everybody who does harmful things or uses anesthesia to a point that becomes a problem. And I want to be very clear about that. We all use anesthesia, right? We all do. If you think about the past 2 years with the pandemic, especially the first year, I think a lot of us were leaning hard into whether it's Netflix or comfort food or online shopping. That might be me a little bit. We all were finding things that soothed us and numbed feelings of fear and worry or anxiety or stress. So anesthesia, I think, is a pretty human experience. What you guys are probably going to be dealing with are people who have chosen forms of anesthesia that in and of themselves are immediately problematic, right? They're using drugs, they're drinking, they're whatever, or they're doing stuff that just kind of gets them into trouble over time. For a lot of young women, the attention of men is such a high and such anesthesia for them that they keep picking the wrong guy, or they keep making very poor decisions for themselves or their children. It's all in an attempt to numb and feel okay. So that's not to say that they don't need help with that. That's not to say that there shouldn't be consequences for some choices. All I'm saying is what you may be seeing in some of the folks you work with is a desire to stop this from happening. Whatever that level of terror and panic was for my professor, some of the women you work with will experience that. And some of them are doing the stuff they're doing, even though it's going to make you go, oh my God, in order to make that stop or to prevent it from happening. And that, I think, immediately shifts how we look at them, how we understand them, and perhaps how we advocate for them. Right? Okay. Now, the last one is very, very simple compared to the first quote, but for me, it really sums up why I'm so grateful and excited that you guys are doing this and that I get to spend a few hours with you. Pierre Janet was a 19th century French neurologist. Probably not something you thought you would be hearing about today, but he and other doctors were the ones who really began our modern understanding of the brain and how it works. And they also identified trauma. So people like Freud and all the people in the next generation based a lot of their work on Janet and some others. And this is what he said about trauma. He said, trauma is a disease of not being able to be here. And it's so elegantly simple, but to me, it really sums up why trauma can be heartbreaking. Not simply because it causes people to have these day-to-day problems, but because in some cases, when it's early enough, chronic enough, severe enough, and many of you will work with women who have all three of those things, it literally keeps you from being able to live your life. So let me give you an example. Let's say that, I don't know, let's say Tamika is starting her first day as a staff person with me. So she shows up bright and early. It's her first day of work, brought some Timbits for everybody. Great. And I take one look at her and she's wearing a black and white shirt with spots on it. And for who knows what reason, I take one look at that and I punch her right in the face. Right? So what's going to happen to me? What happens? Well, I'm out of your program, right? That's probably it for me. Or I'm out of the apartment complex, or I'm out of my job, or whatever. I worked with young people and young adults who over and over and over again had messed up situations for themselves. And when you understand that what's happening there, let's say, is at some point in my past, somebody hurt me or scared me who looked like Tamika, or they were wearing a black and white shirt, or who knows what, right? Now, was I in actual danger from Tamika in that moment? No. Look at her. She's super sweet. She brought Timbits. Of course, I'm not in any danger. Just like my professor was perfectly safe in that movie theater. Right? But it doesn't matter, because in that moment, my brain and my body react as if I am in danger. And now I'm not responding appropriately to my environment anymore. I'm not interacting with my life. I am not here. I'm somewhere and someone else, but I'm not here. And when you learn about trauma and you talk with people who grapple with trauma, this is something that comes up over and over and over again, is that they will say various versions of, I can't live my own life. I'm not in my life. Right? So your guys's willingness to spend this time and whatever training you've already had, whatever training you're getting with me, whatever you may do in the future, your willingness to do this, I truly believe in some, maybe many cases, is some woman's best shot at being able to start living her actual life here and now, which is why I'm so, so grateful that you guys are doing this. Okay, so we're going to jump ahead, and I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but we will take a break about halfway through so people can get up and move around and stuff. But let's go ahead here. And I always have so much more to talk about than I have time for. But okay, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on definitions, but I do want to give you just a basic one to get started with. And there's our friend Bessel van der Kolk again for a quote here at the bottom. So trauma is anything that makes you feel like you're about to die, or that is so emotionally overwhelming that a word that is sometimes used is annihilating. Your sense of self, your sense of safety, your sense of order in the world is just completely blown apart by the emotional stress of what you're experiencing. So let me give you an example of the first one. Let's say that I'm driving to, let's say Toledo, and I'm on some weird route on 23. It's taking me through these little farm fields and patches and whatever. And the roads get kind of dicey, and they're sort of 2-lane roads. And someone runs me off the road, right? They cross whatever, they didn't see me. They cross the center line, and I roll my car into a ditch. Now, I'm not seriously injured, but I'm trapped in my car. Maybe it was crushed around me. I can smell gasoline, and I'm out in the middle of who knows where. And I have to wait for hours for someone to come by and see me and get me out. And at any moment, I think the car might catch on fire. In that moment, am I thinking that I might die? Yeah, 100%, right? So that one's not hard to get. You know, if I experienced that and later had panic attacks or some symptoms of PTSD, you'd be like, Well, now let's change it a little. Now let's say that I am 4 years old and I live in a household with a lot of violence. There's a lot of hitting and screaming and yelling and throwing things, and the cops are called and all of that. For whatever reason, no one is harming me. No one's hitting me. No one's physically mistreating me, but I'm seeing this. And especially at night, I'm hearing it. And in some ways, hearing without being able to see might be even worse, because then I'm just imagining, right? Would you imagine that I might feel the same as adult Lara being trapped in a car, that at any moment I'm about to be wiped out? Yeah, that would be emotionally annihilating. Now, the reason I go into that in such detail is that as we start talking about trauma, or those of you who have trauma training, you know that it can be a little bit of a trap, that we start thinking about what traumatic experiences can be. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later on today. And I think that's helpful. And there's some things, as I said, where almost anybody going through it, you'd be like, yeah, I think that person might experience some trauma from that. But it really has to do with what my coping capacity is, how I understand what's going on around me, and how I feel like I can deal with it. So even though that 4-year-old me is not in any physical danger, no one is harming me, I am not about to die physically, but emotionally, it is just as impactful. In fact, there's some interesting studies where they do brain scans of people exposed to different kinds of trauma. So if I remember correctly, some belonged to a combat veteran who'd seen a lot of active duty. One was a child who'd experienced sexual assault, and one was a woman who'd been in a long-term emotionally abusive relationship. The brain activity and the brain changes that they saw were identical. So our brains really don't distinguish between the stress of my life is actually threatened, or I'm just emotionally overwhelmed by the stress going on around me, or whatever. There are only so many ways we can react to it, and the impact on our brains is pretty much the same. The reason I say that is that it's easy to dismiss something if it didn't happen to the body. Right? So imagine one of your younger mothers, let's say she was in high school and she was bullied and somebody sprained her wrist every day at school. You'd be like, oh my God. First of all, you'd say, we have to do something about that. And the next thing you'd say would be, we've got to give her some pain medicine and we've got to treat this. And this is terrible. Well, now imagine that girl tells you that she's not being physically harmed, but she is being teased and isolated and humiliated every day at school. It is more likely that the adults in her life or at that school might say, you know what, you just need to ignore it. Don't give them that power over you. Which is, that's okay. I understand why people say stuff like that. But the point is, we working with that young woman might be quicker to dismiss it and go, oh, that's too bad. But what we need to understand is that the impact on her brain might have been the same as if someone broke her wrist every day. The brain really doesn't distinguish between different kinds of pain, emotional pain, physical pain, Our brain registers it on the same network, if you will, right? So what happens to us emotionally can be just as damaging as what happens to us physically. And that, I think, is really the important point here. And then the last thing that van der Kolk says here, an experience becomes traumatic, not just stressful, but traumatic, when the human organism becomes overwhelmed and reacts with helplessness and paralysis. So let me go back to the car crash scenario just for a second. If I'm in the same situation, right, I get run off the road, I roll my car into a ditch, but this time, you know, I'm still not seriously injured. And this time I can unbuckle myself and crawl out right away. Might I experience that as traumatizing? Sure. But I am less likely to experience it as a trauma because I was able to do something, right? I'm flooded with adrenaline and all those fight or flight chemicals, and which are there to help me move. They help me do something to keep myself safe. And I can crawl out and I can get away from the car and I can walk somewhere to get some help. I am less likely to experience it as a trauma than someone who's trapped. Now, obviously, we sometimes work with people who have been physically trapped somewhere or physically overwhelmed and held by another person. Sometimes the trap is more metaphorical. They were trying to tell an adult that they were being sexually abused and they weren't believed. Or they were in a school setting and they were bullied and there wasn't sufficient support for them. They were in an abusive relationship where they were financially exploited, right? Don't even get me started on sex trafficking. That's a whole other range of stuff, right? So there are many instances where it's not just the stress of the experience, but it's also the experience of helplessness or inability to get away or to do anything to stop it. That is what can take something over the line from stressful to traumatizing. And there are many, many different versions of that some of the women you're going to work with have experienced. Okay, so zooming ahead, I already sort of talked about this, but I'll just make this point. There are some traumas that trauma therapists and trauma researchers describe as capital T or big T traumas, right? These are the things that if I tell you I experienced it, some of these, even just one time, you would not be confused. So sexual or physical assaults, verbal or emotional abuse and manipulation, war, natural or man-made disasters, catastrophic illness, traumatic grief, you guys kind of get it. So if I told you, for example, that I survived a plane crash and that I had PTSD as a result, none of you would be confused, right? LaShawn would not be like, just the one plane crash? Huh, weird. Okay, I guess. Like she would get it. She'd be like, yeah, PTSD, that sounds about right, right? So sometimes we describe big T traumas as life-altering, life-disrupting events. It's such a big, unusual thing that, again, depending on the situation, it completely disrupts daily life for that person. So that's a big T trauma. Now, we know that there's some things that can make an event more or less likely to be traumatizing. These are pretty common sense, right? How long it lasted, how intense was it, what time of day, interestingly. Things that happen at night tend to be more traumatizing. I think that's because it's harder for us to orient ourselves and get our bearings and know what's going on. Did we have any warning? Did someone intend to hurt us? So for example, a natural disaster like a tornado, there's not much anybody can do about that. Versus like a terrorist attack, someone tried to hurt a large number of people, right? Someone intended for that to happen. How many people were affected? And the last one is probably the most important here. Research tells us that the support system of the person during and especially after the event really will play a role in how traumatizing it was for them. The better the support system, and that includes a natural support system, right? People who aren't paid to be in that person's life. The more robust a support system they have, the more protection they have from the stressful event actually becoming a trauma. That just kind of makes sense. Now, here's where we need to talk. There are also some personal factors that can make people more or less vulnerable to trauma. You guys, my guess is you guys have already worked a lot with many of these things. So substance abuse. There's probably a genetic component to resilience. I don't know if any of you guys have ever worked with families or multiple generations of a family, but you know exactly what I'm talking about here. You can take two kids, same family, same experiences, and one of those kids is like kind of okay-ish. You know, they've got some stuff, but they've got some resilience, and they're going to be okay. Different kid, same family, roughly the same situation, not okay. Sizzling hot mess, to use the clinical term, right? So we know that even within families, there can be some genetic variation that seem to help people in terms of having a little more emotional resilience or being a little more vulnerable. A history or family history of mental illnesses. One of the reasons it's so critical that you guys are doing what you're doing is that when a parent, especially a mother, is overwhelmed with depression or anxiety or stress from poverty or homelessness, that has a direct impact on that baby. Right? We know that. So once again, what you guys are doing is incredibly important. And when there's been a family history of any kind of mental illness or emotional disorder, it does seem to make people more vulnerable to the stress of trauma. But the most important one right here that I want to talk to you guys about is the first one, a previous history of trauma, stressors, or abuse. Generally speaking, and post-traumatic growth is a sort of a complicated conversation right now, but generally speaking, the more trauma one has experienced, especially if you haven't gotten treatment and support for it, the more traumas just kind of keep hitting harder and harder. Now that's kind of common sense, right? Why would I spend time with you on this? Because sometimes how this person is assessed for trauma depends on how they present to the person doing the assessing. In other words, some people are seen as vulnerable, and some people are seen as tough. When I worked with young people and young adults, there were some kids that I was told, oh, they're a street kid, they're tough. And especially young people, some of the young women you guys work with, they do sometimes put on this hard thing, right? It's usually very thin. And underneath that is a bunch of goo, right? Underneath that is a lot of vulnerability and a lot of pain and a lot of trauma. But my experience is girls were more likely to be seen as vulnerable, and boys were more likely to be seen as survivors, and especially boys and young men of color. So let me tell you a little story about that. I was contracted once with an agency in a different part of the state just to do clinical supervision. What they needed was somebody to go through files and sign off on diagnoses that young people in the program had been given over, I don't know, there'd been a gap, and they needed somebody to go through and do that. So I would take a few hours a day and just go through files and read the chart and read the diagnosis and sign off on it. So I got to see this firsthand. And this was a large agency. They served a large number of kids from urban and rural and suburban and white and black and everything, right? Girls, boys. And what I saw was, for every young man of color, despite histories, when they had a history that was, again, to use the clinical term, trauma-rama, right? Violence, poverty, disruption at home at an early age, multiple caregivers, having some in foster placement, bouncing around in and out. What I saw over and over and over again, and I think this is true for girls of color as well, although I think it's a bigger issue for boys, is they were given every diagnosis under the sun, mostly behavioral, right? So oppositional, conduct disorder, ADHD, intermittent explosive disorder. I don't even know what the hell that means, to be honest with you. Everything. Now, I want you guys to guess how many of those cases, those young men, were given a diagnosis of PTSD. Any guesses? 0. Out of maybe 200. Not, wow, really wasn't very many. I mean, I started counting, literally 0. Girls are more likely, and we've got lots of research to back this up, girls are more likely to be given an emotional disorder like depression, anxiety, trauma. Boys tend to be given, girls look sad, right? We kind of decide who we think is a victim. We decide who we think is vulnerable, right? So how I feel about you, how you present to me may affect how I diagnose you, because people are people and they have their own implicit bias and whatever. or explicit bias sometimes. So girls tend to look more vulnerable. They're more likely to be given a diagnosis that a boy should qualify for exactly the same presentation. Boys are more likely to be seen. The saying is girls look sad and boys look bad, right? But that starts to shift if we're talking about young women of color. Then we start to see more of the behavioral diagnoses. They're oppositional. I love oppositional. I think I'm oppositional. Like a friend of mine who worked a lot with trauma used to say, the kid who's oppositional is the kid who feels safe when they say no. Many of you are going to be working with young people and adults who feel safe when they say no. In fact, I'm pretty confident oppositional defiance doesn't even exist. The point here is this: when you are working with a woman and you are given any kind of diagnosis, keep in mind a couple of things. One is that we have well-researched knowledge that diagnosis sometimes can be accurate and sometimes is vulnerable to bias. And depending on how that person presented, do they present as sweet and vulnerable? Do they present as tough? Are they white versus of color? We haven't even talked about any kind of like LGBTQ issues, whatever. The point is, diagnosis is a snapshot of how someone looked to someone at any given moment. So some diagnoses are very reliable, but some diagnoses, especially if you think this person, this young woman or older woman that you're dealing with, maybe was vulnerable to that kind of bias in the diagnostic process, think about a second opinion. Do we need to advocate that this person go to a therapist who specializes in trauma? Do we know that they got culturally competent diagnosis? Keep that in mind, right? And again, my experience working with young adults, some of those kids can be super obnoxious. And I always liked the ones that were super obnoxious because they were the ones who they had some fight in them. They were my favorites to work with, but they may have pissed people off or freaked them out or scared them. So keep that in mind. Who gets to be vulnerable? Who gets to be traumatized in our society versus who gets to be a problem? That's a social issue, right? Okay. I think I've done enough with that. So let me move on here. So here's another list of trauma. Here's some other things trauma can be: poverty, racism and oppression, not being accepted, not being able to do stuff other people can do, moving to a new home or having a significant change where you live, knowing that you're different from the people around you in some way, not feeling that people are listening to you, being misunderstood, failing at a task. Now, you might be wondering why I put trauma on this slide, because really I could have just labeled this slide 7th grade, right? All of us, I think, have had some, if not all of the experiences on this slide at some point in our lives. So if some of the stuff on this list is just being a human being, why are we including it as potential trauma? Well, the issue here is not how intense the experience is, generally speaking. It's something else. So I'm going to actually use you guys as a little example. Okay. So everybody, if you're taking notes or checking emails or whatever, just stop for a second. And I want you to think about something in your own life. I want you to think about a time. Let me choose one here. Okay. I want you to pick a time that you failed at something. All right. And let's say that it was something important to you. It wasn't like, I guess water skiing's not for me, but something that really mattered to you, something that you tried really hard. Maybe other people saw you fail and you failed. How did that feel? I'm not asking you to share that or tell me what the experience was. I just want you to think about it, how that felt for you. And I can see a few of you guys, and I can see everybody kind of going, ugh, right? And I know if I were in a room with you and I could see your faces, I would all see the, ugh, right? And in fact, I have a confession to make. I cheated a little bit. I picked something that I knew would resonate with you guys. I know that each one of you hates failing, hates it, and is really good at not failing. Do you know how I know that? Because of the jobs you guys all have. You have responsible jobs. You guys have, my guess has done a lot of different kind of difficult or leadership sorts of things in your careers. So here's what I know about how you feel about failing. I know you don't like it. And I also know that you probably, most if not all of you, I hope all of you, have a couple of things. One thing that you have, I hope, is a group of people around you who know and care about you, friends, family, significant others, whatever. And they're sort of your cheering section, right? So when you failed at something, they're there to pick you up and say, you know what? I think you're the bee's knees. You're going to go get them. I hope you have people telling you you're the bee's knees. The other thing I think you probably have is you guys have strategies for dealing with the failure. So if we were live and we had time to do this, I might ask a few of you guys to share your experience. And probably what you would say is you either persisted until you were successful, you studied harder, you went back again or whatever, or you did something different. You found out, oh, okay, accounting isn't for me. I'm going to go into social work, which was probably a terrible career choice, by the way. We'll talk about that at the break. But you found ways to be successful, to transform that failure into some kind of success, right? Okay, now I want you to think about the women you're going to be working with. Do all of them have that natural cheering section? The people who pick them up and lift them up? Do they have great coping strategies? No. In fact, many of them have what we could call terrible coping strategies, right? They don't have that repertoire of what to do to transform a failure into a success. So what is it about these experiences that deserve to be included in a trauma training? It's not about intensity, it's about frequency. Ask yourself how often some of the women you work with have experienced some or maybe many of the things on this list. And how often does that come up for them? Once a month? Do they experience it once a week? Once a day? You know that some of the folks you guys work with, it's every day, multiple times a day, every day. I think about some of the teenagers and the young adults that I worked with who struggled in school because they had learning issues that weren't properly identified, or they weren't supported, or they had emotional or behavioral problems that clashed with the classroom. Many of them experienced this all day, every day. And then, the adults around them would wonder why they kept skipping school. I would too. If I had to feel like that in a classroom all day, every day, I wouldn't be there either. I'd have the stomach ache every day, right? So when we're talking about trauma, we've got the big T traumas, the capital T, life-disrupting events, maybe once in a lifetime kind of thing. And now we've got these. It's just a little bit, but it's day after day after day after day. For some of you working with older women, let's say in their 30s or even 40s, how long have they experienced this? Decades of these little stressors. So the first list of traumas we call big T or capital T, and the smaller list we call little t. So pretty fancy. But it simply refers to the fact that if this only happens occasionally, and if you've got good coping skills and you've got a good support system, you're probably not going to experience this as traumatizing. But when it's happening over and over and over, and you don't have that support network, and you don't have those coping strategies, then over time, it's cumulative. And in fact, we believe that given enough time and given enough little T's, we start to see the same brain changes, the same neurological reactions, the same triggering events that we do with somebody who had one big T trauma. So when we talk about traumas, we're really talking about two different kinds. We're talking about big T's and little T's, right? And I'll leave you guys with this. So a friend of mine is at the Ohio Department of Mental Health and is a retired Ohio Highway Patrol officer. And he works a lot now with first responders and law enforcement about trauma. And this is how he explains traumas to them. He says, big T is like being attacked by a bear, and little T is like being attacked by ducks. Now, a bear attack, just one bear attack, and you're going to be pretty messed up, right? Everyone's going to be like, oh my God. If it's just one or two ducks, you can probably fight those off. And I just use this example partly because I think it's funny to imagine someone fighting a duck. But now imagine it's a bunch of ducks and it's every day. Given enough time, and given enough ducks, and the damage starts to look the same. And again, and this is sort of the point we'll wrap up with, and then we'll take our break. This sort of goes back to the point we made earlier. Your ability to recognize that it's not always the bear attacks. Sometimes it's someone who's had a life filled with ducks, because other people may be likely to minimize that. You know, when, especially if you've got a group of people and some of them have experienced big T trauma. So they've been raped, they've been trafficked, they've been this, they've been that. And maybe someone else hasn't, or we don't know, which is another problem we'll talk about in a little bit. But regardless, it's easy to look at someone who hasn't had the big T's and go, oh, they're fine. Or they're just being a pain in the butt, or they're just, you know what I mean? So understanding the nature of big T and little t will help you not minimize some of the damage that some of the folks you're going to work with have experienced. So on that note, let's go ahead and take our break, and let me check and see what time it is. It is 10:06. So let's come back at 10:15.